With the rising racial tensions that we saw over 2020 after the death of George Floyd, and with the continued issues in society around race and the racial rhetoric that we've been seeing even into 2021, have you been found yourself asking, well, how am I supposed to respond to race and what is this really all about? If you have, join us for this conversation because today we're going to look into the root and the origin of the concept of race and how that has affected us today. Hop into this conversation with us. Let's find the root. Let's find the root.
Welcome everybody to Let's Find the Root. You're here with Jordan Jones and
Caleb Jones.
we're glad to be back with you. Another series, guys. It is so exciting and we're so happy to be here with you today. So, guys, we're going to be discussing the concept of race, and we're going to really be looking at where the term race has stemmed from. So, guys, sit tight, be expecting a conversation that's going to challenge the very way that you see things as currently constructed in regards to race. But bear with us and enjoy the conversation. So, as usual, guys, we start off with Caleb giving us our introduction, and then we're going to get into this conversation today. So, Caleb, kick us off.
Yeah. So, Root family, let's dig into this. The series that we'll be having a long conversation over a few episodes about race. And first of all, we want to really deconstruct the origin of race. You know how it is with Let's Find the Root. We're here to dig up these roots and find out what we're really talking about when we talk about these types of concepts. So, race. Okay, the first question which you want to look at is what actually is race? And first of all, I'd look at the etymology of the word race, because if we were to actually look at it, race didn't actually come into the English language as a word until I believe the 14th century. So in 1512, in 1580, it came into the English language as a word that was commonly used by the people. But the word actually wasn't used in reference to human beings at that time. It was actually used in reference to animals or cattle as a way to distinguish between species. So that's an interesting way just to even begin the conversation about where we understand this concept of race to come from.
Yes, definitely. And, when we think about race today, even before Caleb goes on further, we think of race as something that, I guess determines us in regards to whether that be our cultural backgrounds, whether that be down to the color of our skins, or whether that be from where, our families, birthed from. We would deem that as race, or sometimes even we would deem race as particular country or place that we are from. So when you think about it in that regard, how we deem race today is quite different to maybe even the beginnings of the root word, as Caleb has mentioned. So it's interesting for Caleb to say that the conversation starts off with actually it's a term that was not necessarily used for human beings. I believe that it was also used for species of horses, primarily to distinguish the different types of horses, as well as Caleb said, cattle and things of that nature. So,
Yeah,
guys,
like you're
isn't that
saying, George.
interesting? Isn't that
Yeah.
interesting that what we deem as race, or the term race in its wording, doesn't actually necessarily refer to human beings? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay, let's
think
walk on.
that's interesting. And what Jordan was referring to, I think I said 14th century, what I meant to say 16th century. But like Jordan was saying, that is from it that the English word race is taken from roots in the French language and the Italian language,
That's right.
and a lot of study has gone around it to concerning where this actually came from. And as Jordan said, yeah, it was it could have been used and understood in terms of looking at horses or cattle, that kind of farming term. That's quite interesting. But to dig a little bit further, we want to kind of really look at when did the concept of race in terms of our understanding of it with white, black, Asian, those types of categories come into it. because to be honest, those don't logically make sense. It doesn't actually have like it doesn't make sense to actually call someone, you're white, you're black, and then you're Asian. It's like saying color, continent.
Wow, wow. Let's just stop you right there, Caleb. Are you telling the audience that that our kind of what's the word? I guess you call it the way in which we, you know, see ourselves and label ourselves is not necessarily how it should be. So if I, deem myself as a, Caribbean person, call myself black, that are you saying that I'm aligning with the wrong term here, or are you going to unpack this today? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I
Mm,
think from what you're saying, it really does go back to the original usage of the word. So you can actually
right.
trace back the concept of race or the first term. Let's look at white first. So you can trace back the
Mm-hmm.
first usage of the word white to America in the Maryland colony,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's found in what is called anti-miscegenation laws. So
Yes.
anti-miscegenation laws are laws that prohibit the marriage between different
Ethnic backgrounds.
ethnic backgrounds, but
Mm-hmm.
because at that time the concept of race did not actually exist. So at that point there was no existence of the concept of race as we understand it today.
Wow.
So
Wow.
what we'll actually see is that in that colony in
Mm-hmm.
Maryland, you see that you have a group of what was termed, they would call them Negroes, so people of African descent,
Mm-hmm.
and then you had groups of European descent, and that they did not want the mixing between the classes. I think they actually said in some of the proceedings from their meetings at the time within that colony that it was a disgrace that the free women of the free European women would actually choose to marry Negroes at the
Mm,
time, because to be honest, the divisions that we see today are not actually were not actually existent in that time in the same way, because the terms were not utilized. So I think if you look into the 1680s, that's when you actually see the first actual usage of the word white.
mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you can immediately say that the term white, it originates in an American concept that happened in the late 1600s, and it originates from a usage by the lawmakers in the Maryland colony. So
Mm-hmm.
immediately right there, we can just immediately say that that concept is not as old as we think, and
Mm-hmm.
is actually the thinking and the mindset of those that um, did not like the fact that free white women were marrying out of choice at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, at that time, they
That's right.
chose to marry um, men of African descent, and they were upset by that. So that's where you first see the terminology of the word white,
Wow.
and
Wow.
that's crazy in and of
Wow.
itself.
Wow. So the anti-miscegenation laws, um,
Anti-miscegenation laws, yeah.
anti yes, miscegenation laws. Thank you, Kevin. Um, that we see here that that law is for the dividing, or was put in place to stop marriage between people of different ethnicities.
Yeah.
So as Caleb said, they're white to Negroes at the time, or Europeans to Negroes, and it was a point of division.
And you
So
know
we
what's
see.
interesting about
Okay.
that, George, as well?
Okay.
Thank you for highlighting that. You know, the laws didn't actually prohibit um, the marriage between Native Americans and
Mm,
uh, European descent,
Europeans. That's right.
because
Yeah.
the problem, they didn't have an issue on that terms for some reason, because that obviously that caste system of race had not even been formed yet at that time. It was
Right.
only between the two. And what was interesting actually is that before the law of the in the 1680s, there was a law, I think in 1664, and that law was to prohibit again the Negroes marrying the freeborn white women.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what happened was they said that if you marry into, if you marry a Negro, you and your child would be put into slavery if they were, if they were a slave. So that's what would happen. But you know what actually happened? You think, okay, the women would say, I don't want to go into slavery. I'm not going to marry these men.
Mm-hmm.
No, there was actually more marriages. And so they actually said they were disgusted by that behavior. And instead, because the punishment was on those white women, they said, okay, to actually discourage this, because some of the owners of some of the slaves would say, yeah, that's fine, go ahead, marry them, because they know that they're getting more free labor essentially. And the women were basically choosing like, yeah, I'll go into it. And
Mm-hmm.
so they still made those choices, and literally instead they said, we don't like this, okay, we're gonna make the slave owners actually pay a fee for that happening.
Mm.
So that's where, and then in that writing, they used that term in the 1680s. And they said for European descent, they use this term of white to
Mm-hmm.
categorize the European descent and kind of cause division between them, as Jordan's saying.
Yes, so as we can see from the very foundations of these terms being used, that was a point of division, not of bringing together. So then we have to question, um, what is race, and is race something that has been there to cause a point of us coming together or separation? And from the very root of what we've kind of unpicked here, and from the very foundations of when the first term of white or was used, we see here that it was a point of segregation, a point of division, a point of separation, and to kind of put people in um, a place of, um, let's say, isolation from other
Yeah,
people of different minds and of different skin tones, of different backgrounds, and this is completely contrary, we would say, to our belief structures in our Christian faith. So it's interesting that race in its essence has never been something to bring together but to divide. But I believe we're going to go into that
yeah.
further.
And I
Mm,
think I think that's important. Obviously, from this podcast, we're discussing things that broaden outside of what seem to be the scope of religion, but
mm,
our belief actually affects our worldview, and that's
yeah.
why Jordan made reference to that. But I think it's really important that what Jordan said, that the conception of it was to divide people, and that's really important, and that's
Mm,
not just conjecture, actually, because what coincides with this actual time that the word white was actually brought about was a rebellion that happened within the colonies, within the Maryland colony at that time. And it was quite a big one. And what's interesting about this, it happened in the years between 1675 and 1676. So that's in between that time where I said 1660s, where you saw that first, like, we don't like the union, and
mm-hmm,
then the 1680s when they coined that term white.
mm,
So what happened was that there was this thing called the Bacon's Rebellion. And what happened within this rebellion was actually the union between indentured white workers. And when I use the term indentured, what it was is that basically in the colonies, they needed workers. So they needed workers. And at that time, they didn't actually have the transatlantic slave trade had not actually taken up speed in the way that it was about to. So the actual workforce, the majority of the workforce was actually poor people
mm,
from Britain that was sent over as indentured workers, and they were basically sent to work a certain term.
mm-hmm,
So they were actually in, like, working for a master for a certain term. They used that instead of using the word slave, but they're basically in the same conditions.
mm-hmm,
So what happened in these Baker's rebellion is that these indentured workers, they worked their time, but after they worked their time and they'd finished, being a slave for that master, they had no land to work for themselves. So there was no good for them to come out of slavery. So they had to work again for the upper class of the colony. And so these people got frustrated. So because they saw themselves on the same, in the same position and in the same predicament as some of the Negroes, as they term them. So some
mm-hmm,
of the African descent men who had come over. And bear in mind, there was not just slaves, there were actually free men that were
Mm-hmm.
at the time that were black in that society, because obviously that terminology of race hadn't really manifested to identify slavery in that sense with the African descent in that same way. So there was actually free men at the time. That's something that's quite interesting, I think, for
Okay,
people
but
to understand.
don't just rush over that. Stay there 1 second.
Yeah.
So are you saying that these free Negro men
Hmm.
put themselves into this particular environment or work, occupation, so that they could provide, for themselves? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
that's not what I'm happy that you said that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that
Mm,
they were brought over, and I'm definitely not saying. I
right.
definitely the transatlantic slave trade was a
Mm-hmm.
horrific thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that the height of it and the justification of it had
Mm-hmm.
not yet been birthed. So
Right.
the ideology of race had not yet fully come into its conception for it to be
Okay.
able to treat people. Because one issue, and thank you for reminding me of that, George. One issue was that if a person of African descent that
Right.
was a slave
Mm-hmm.
came to the colonies in America and then got baptized. So that's a word for basically, that's a Christian concept
Yeah.
of identifying with
Mm-hmm.
Jesus Christ and becoming a believer. If they got baptized, you couldn't call them a slave.
Right. Mm.
So as soon as they got baptized, they were free
Mm-hmm.
men.
Yeah.
So that's why you had some free Negro men, because at the time it was not okay. And this is why at that time it was not okay to treat people in a certain way if they were of that certain status. So it was basically, it's quite interesting actually,
Mm-hmm.
because there was not this ideology of race that detracted between different groups and said you're not human or you're not the same level. They had
Mm-hmm.
none of that yet. So that's quite important. So, I am saying that the it's the transatlantic slave was horrible, but at that time, just because you were a Negro didn't mean you were a slave,
Right. Mm-hmm.
because the concept of race had not been identified
Mm-hmm.
in the way that it is now. So, okay, so yeah, so moving that on, in the Bacon's Rebellion, what happened was the indentured workers, yeah, the indentured white European workers and the Africans, which were some were indentured, some were enslaved, and some were free, partnered together to overthrow the upper class. That's what's
Okay.
important, because
Right.
you know what? They didn't have the concept of race in their head. They had that they were of the same group, they were of the same
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
served the same problems. So those European descent and African descent banded together
Mm-hmm.
and caused a huge uproar within the colonies, and the upper class were afraid.
Mm-hmm.
They were extremely afraid. They even had to call over troops from Britain to help them to quell
Mm-hmm.
this rebellion, because the power of the indentured workers, the power of the Europeans and the Negroes coming together was too much for the upper class. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens now? This happens. They just about quell the rebellion. What do? What is the main strict, like, anyone knows this? Read I think it's called the Art of War.
Mm.
You divide and conquer.
Conquer, divide and conquer. That's
You
right.
divide
That's
and
right.
conquer. So what do?
Mm-hmm.
They make up a new category.
Mm-hmm.
And 1676, you see that rebellion. 1680, the first term or usage or conception of the concept of race in in usage
Wow.
of white.
Wow.
So
Wow.
literally, they knew
Mm-hmm.
we need to give the people, that we need to set some boundaries. And the upper class, because the problem was the upper class was so high up, they had all the benefits and they were untouchable. The lower class, they didn't have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So the upper class needed to make a way in which they made the white indentured workers basically seem like, oh, we're the same, we're the same
Mm-hmm.
type of people.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to divide them and kind of tie them in. So what do? They say, "Oh, you guys are elite. You're
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
white."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow.
And then
Wow.
now you start to see the evolution
Mm-hmm.
of this concept of whiteness, because the term black didn't actually come about then. It
Mm-hmm.
was just Negroes, which
Yeah, Negroes. Yeah.
does translate to black in a way, but they're basically describing it doesn't have the connotation it was going to take.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was just to refer to people of African descent. So
Mm-hmm.
it's crazy. It's genuinely like that concept is literally used, as Jordan said, to divide.
Wow, to divide and conquer, and just to even recap that, in that time they would not have seen each other, especially the indentured workers would not see each other as anything different. They were looking at their
Mm.
brother or their sister, not
Oh.
necessarily looking at the color, not necessarily looking at the background. They just saw a brother and a sister, and they
They would
thought
have
that
been working together in the
yeah, work
fields.
together in the field. You know, what I mean, they were one. They were one, loving on each other, doing what they could to help each other. And you know what's so important, and we see that when affliction comes and when we put in difficult situations that rocks our very core of our beliefs, we tend to come together as a unit. So we
Mm.
see where there's an issue that has arisen that is affecting everybody, we see that people band together, and we saw that this is a common case again. But now we see the beginnings of where we talk about entitlement, where you have different statuses in society, where people have certain levels of authority, or kind of have more of an entitlement to certain things, or can go to
Yeah.
certain places. And we see that this concept is still here today.
Yeah, it's a kind of a hierarchical system trying to
Mm,
justify me thinking that I'm better than you and that we're not all equals. That's the real issue of it. And just like, you know, Jordan said, it's we found ways to band together when tough times come. The world came together against
mm,
what happened with George Floyd. The world was just like,
that's right.
this
Mm,
is just not right. But what we're really looking at here, which, and I think this is a question, if the concept of race is rooted in division, can we ever unite around it?
wow, wow, wow. And
That's
guess,
the
guys, that's a comment. That's a question for you to drop into the comments.
Yeah.
Can we unite against a concept that was made to divide? Can we unite using this term to bring about justice in the world, or to bring about a better equality amongst us and diversity? Is
because it's
that the right term? Mm,
yeah, is that the right way to view things? Because if you think about it, it's only 400 years old. As we're looking back, I'm saying this late 1600s, so it's less than 400 years actually. In reality,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
about um, under 400 years. So it begs the question of what did people view in terms of different groups, because obviously we're not ignoring, and this is something which I think a lot of people do. They ignore, they say like, I don't see color, I don't see race or whatever, and it's kind of a way to omit the fact of people are unique and different. I feel
yes.
like that's a problem because the
Hmm.
world did identify the different groups. Um, and how did they identify that, Jordan? How did, before this concept of race, how was different groupings around the world identified? I think we see it in the
Yes,
Bible.
Bible. Yes, we do. We do see in the Bible that we see in the Bible, that we see that it was you would see the differences between or from people due to their ethnicity, so their
Yeah,
background. So,
exactly.
as opposed to the color of their skin, it was
So
more
just
of where you
unpack
were
that,
from.
unpack
So
that.
yeah, so if we were to look at if we go back to the word in the Bible, if we look at the word nation in the Bible, we get the word ethnos, which we get the word ethnicity from.
Hmm.
Okay, and ethnicity talks about
Ethnos is what type of what language does that come from?
that's a Greek word. That's a Greek term.
Okay,
Okay,
cool.
so when we look at our current word nation in our English literature and our language, it
Well,
translates the
from a
word.
biblical
Oh
standpoint,
yeah,
then yeah.
from a biblical standpoint, we see the word ethnos, which obviously is a Greek term as well, which then we get the word ethnicity from.
Hmm.
So as we could tell, this talks of the particular places. So you'll hear us say things like this, or you hear the terms like this. If we talk about myself, I'm a Afro-Caribbean person.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
And it's interesting if you go to sign a form, or if you to ask at school, you'd see that they would say Black Afro Caribbean, which is
Quite
interesting in
interesting.
itself.
I know.
Um, but my
Should we
descent.
be okay with that, Jordan?
Yes, well, no, I don't. Well, no, I don't think it
Based on what we've
necessarily should.
just what we've
Yeah,
like the initial
yeah,
unpacking of that concept of white, should we be okay with that? It
yeah.
goes back to that question: can we? Is that a category that we want to accept?
Or associate ourselves with. But then,
Mhm.
this is where people say, "When, but I'm black. What do I then? What do I then align myself to? I am black and I'm proud to be black. So what term do I, align myself with? And I know it's hard for people to when we're saying this that this term was not brought to necessarily
Or the
bring
concept
or
rather.
the concept rather was not brought for you to be in a better or to be seen in a better light,
Yeah,
rather than it was brought to kind of bring you into submission
subjugate you
and
essentially.
subject and bring you down. When Afro Caribbean releases you into the fullness of who you are, in my opinion, because it
So
talks about your name,
okay then,
the
why do you
background of where you come.
why do you
So
think that? Why do you think
because
that?
I believe it encompasses all of you. It encompasses who you are. It talks about where your family's from. It talks about your nation. It talks about your culture, and you can subscribe to that. When black kind of is never used in the right connotations, in my belief, it's not said to bring you up necessarily, but it's a
Okay,
point of holding you to a certain standard.
so
That's what I would
okay,
say.
if you're looking at that, and I think you raised a good point. So you said that with ethnicity, it draws attention to language, it draws attention to
Mm.
culture, it
Hmm.
draws attention to family, it
Yes.
draws attention to your birthplace or your place of origin.
Origin. Yeah.
So with the concept of what we've just said with white, and in the episodes to come, we're going to unpack where the ideology, because the term white originated there, but the ideology of race didn't actually come about until the 1800s. So we're going to
Hmm.
unpack
Hmm.
that. So what does black encompass actually? And I think that's a tough question for a lot of people.
Hmm.
And we're not doing this to be disrespectful. It's just to ask a real question here. What does the term or the concept of black actually encompass? If we are to look at it from its origins in this divisive
Hmm.
rhetoric by this colony in America, and this is key to remember, like it originated in America
Hmm.
in the late 1600s. This is not some like issue that has like been passed through um like from like antiquity. This is just quite new. So if we understand that, and we understand that that's where it's coming from, what does black actually encompass to us? What does black, the identity of black, actually speak to you, or um, come from? Because to be honest, the difference with Jordan's identity, what Jordan said with ethnicity and with the concept of race, is that first, ethnicity can actually be like traced through your blood, through your genealogy. So your ethnicity, you can take a test and you can actually work out, okay, I'm from a certain African descent, or I'm from European descent, I'm from the uh, uh, Native American descent. Those are types of ethnicities that you can actually trace through blood. Can you trace someone's race? I don't think so, because
No.
I love Jordan always says this. What do you say about race, Jordan? What is race? What do you say? This is your go-to line. He always says it like this: race is a social construct.
Yeah, it is. It is.
It's a
But
social construct. What do
guys,
you
I
mean
want
by
I
that?
want I want I want you guys to drop that in the comments and to just engage in this conversation, guys. What is race to you? What does race mean to you?
Mm,
How when you think about race, how does that make you feel? What comes to your mind? We want you to drop that in the comments, okay? Have a think about it. Get back to us, okay? And guys, we're so thankful for the conversation that we've had so far. There's so much more to come.
mm.
Get ready. Let's find the root. I know, I know, I know, I know, I know,
Yeah,
I know,
this one's
I
a
know.
doozy.
Look,
This one's a doozy, but honestly, join us for this conversation. This is just the first episode of this series discussing race, and we're gonna be unpacking some more of this stuff. You know how it is here, and let's find the
Yeah,
root.
man.
We
You
want
know
to
how
be
it is.
digging up the roots. So if you've liked this content, just consider liking, consider subscribing to this,
Subscribe,
and
guys.
yeah,
Subscribe.
get involved. Get involved. Check us
Listen,
out.
hit us up on our Facebook. Hit us up on our Instagram. Okay. Hit us up on YouTube. Like, subscribe, follow. Guys, your support is so necessary
Yeah,
for what we're doing. We're doing it so that we can bring about not just, true truth, but so that we can also engage as a
yeah.
community. Look, we love you guys, man. We love you.
We
So
want to be about a
please,
community.
it's
That's what
about
Let's Find the
community.
Root is all about.
Yeah,
A
man. Community.
community of learners.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for.
Listen, and we want to be teachable in all things. That's our motto. Be teachable in all things. So, guys, thank you so much, Root family. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And look, we'll see you for our next episode. Wow. To think we started the series like this, boy. Come
Let's
back next
find the
week.
root.